Fáilte go dtí episód sa cheist na tangan, podcréil faoi an Ghaeilge agus a star de aine atá fisreach faoi a gadrah léithí agus a ról in our bhéanúlacht. Welcome to The Language Question, a podcast about the Irish language and its history for anyone curious about their relationship with it and its role in our identity. Our ní san episód sa ná Derek Hollingsworth. Is búnathór agus cathaoirleach pobal Gaeilge cuaigdeag Derek. Is fála mór Gaeilge agus is scríbneoir comma. Derek Hollingsworth is the founder and chair of Pobal Gaeilge Cuaigdeag, the Dublin 15 and Dunboy branch of Conradh na Gaeilge. He is an Irish language learner and is also a writer and founder of the Irish Language Matters blog. Buenas ansalt as an córa sa le Derek, agus tá súlagam go mhuine tú sult as a bheith ag éisteach leis. I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation with Derek as much as I enjoyed having it. Maris gnách, bí cinnte a chlárú ag thelanguagequestion.com/resources chun de achmanaí fálam de séir in aisce a áil agus a bheith ar an eolas faoi gach rud atá ar súl a going ar an show. As usual, please be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources in order to get your complimentary valuable learning resources and to stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests, and to receive exclusive content. Pe Shele, Shulling, Gomwina Tu Sultas. Anyhow, here goes with this episode. I hope you enjoy it. Derek Hollingsworth is the founder and chair of Pobal Gaeilge Cuaigdeag, the Dublin 15 and Dunboyne branch of Conradh na Gaeilge. He is an Irish language learner who has been on a journey of return to his native language since 2011. He is the writer and founder of the Irish Language Matters blog and tweets regularly on Irish Language Matters as @DerekHolly7. Derek a cara tá fáilte is fitheróid ar an show agus tam Harveh buíochtaíocht as a bhelin.
Gur míle mágat is in Tom anasásta bheith kind lása in yo.
Well, we're delighted to be talking to you as well here, Derek, and thank you so much again for joining us. We're very grateful to have you with us. Derek, what I'd like to do at the beginning, as I do with all of our guests, really, is just to go back to the very start of your language journey and language acquisition in your life, and what it looked like for you in terms of growing up, what role Irish would have played in that, and how it went from there.
Okay, so I guess I felt like a bit of an outsider when it comes to the language because I didn't really have any Irish in my life growing up. Similar situation to many kids growing up in Ireland, I suppose. The only contact I had with the language was at school, where I didn't enjoy the subject and I was absolutely horrible at Irish. I think I got a D in Pass Irish in my leaving cert. So, no quality of Irish really to speak of there. I did have a granddad on my mum's side, Owen Burns from Castleblaney and Monaghan, who learned Irish during the revolutionary period. He became quite proficient in Irish, and I remember as a kid, he was kind of respected because he could speak Irish and he could speak it well. He used to write poetry in Irish. He had a really good command of the language. And I suspect that part of my respect for the language is tied up in the respect and the awe I had for my granddad growing up, because he was really like an idol to me when I was a young child, So I suspect that's where the seeds of my connection with the language were sown in childhood with my granddad. As I say, I was brutal at Irish in school, but I never really saw the school subjects as the same thing as the language itself. I was able to separate them. So while I was able to dislike the school subject, I still retained a certain respect for the language. And I always felt embarrassed and ashamed as an Irish person that I couldn't speak Irish. So that was kind of simmering away, but I didn't really do anything about it. For me, growing up as a teen, life was all about football and music. Into the 20s, it was really in my 30s when I first started to take an interest in the language in a big way, or in a bigger way. I suppose what started me off was there were three things happened. First of all, I met an Irish teacher called Moira Vranach. I think she works for BBC Gaeilge, Philóthair. Moira's from Donegal, and she said to me, if you want the language to survive, you have to do one of three things to pass it on to the next generation. You have to raise your kids with Irish, which at the time I knew wasn't going to be an option for me. You have to send your kids to the Gaeltacht, or you have to enroll your children in a Gael school. So that kind of stuck with me. I had no kids at the time, but that did resonate. The second thing that happened then was I was on a holiday in Bella Roma, and I went to Ostia Antica, the old port town of Rome that's about 2,000 years old. And I remember being in there in the baking June heat, uh, admiring the mosaic tiles on the bathroom floors that you can still see 2,000 years later. And I remember thinking, I absolutely love, um, seeing these places in Europe, in, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy. I love these places so much. And then I had a thought. I thought, is there something closer to home that maybe I'm missing? Um, and that kind of triggered an interest in Irish history. And you can't really read too much into Irish history, or listen to too much trad music before you come into contact with the Irish language. Irish names, Irish songs, Irish place names, things like that. So that, in a way, again piqued my curiosity around the language. And then I think the third thing that happened, and the really crucial thing, going back to the encounter with Moira Vratnock, was when my kids started to come along. I remembered what she had said, and I really wanted the children to go to Gael school. And I started to think that maybe I should upgrade my Irish skills a little bit in order to support them with their Irish language journey as well. So I guess that's where the spark came from for me. Um, I've always been a bit brazen as well, Finian. I remember marching into Cumann na Gaelga's office in 2012 without a word of Irish, really, and telling them I wanted to start an Irish language group in my area. And so I got great support there from Brendan Garvey at the time. Um, I got in touch with some teachers from local schools, and we, under the umbrella of Muintir na Gaelga Onger, we decided to put on an event for Seacht na Gaelga. This would have been around 2012 at the time. And we arranged music and stuff for a local pub, advertised it online and so on. And on the night, all the other teachers that were in the group contacted me to say they couldn't make it. So I became the sole host of an Irish language event where the sum of my Irish at the time was basically being able to say Diagwish, Kunnisatatu, and Slán. So um, that was embarrassing, but the language journey requires you to have thick skin sometimes and to take a chance, take a risk, and that. So that night, Paula Melvin, who's Uachtarán Cumann na Gaeilge, walked in, and she was a great inspiration. It was news to me that you could have people living in Dublin who were living their lives a lot through the Irish language, as was the case with Paula. So with Paula and other people, then we co-founded Pobl Gaeilge Cuaig Déag around that time. So that's going back to about 2012.
There's a huge amount to just maybe unpack in relation to that, Derek. It's an extraordinary kind of progression. I think you almost went like it seems you went from 0 to 100 miles an hour in terms of your Irish language journey there. But just for a second, I'd like to just maybe come back because that seems to be a key moment for you, that connection with that native speaker Mar Bernach, so, but can you remember what, I mean, it was she said to you that it was the ability to keep the language alive. In order for us to keep the language alive, you would need to either raise your kids through Irish, send your kids to a Gaeltacht, or send them to a Gael school. I mean, it was the future of the language, the keeping the language alive, was that something that really must have really resonated with you when you heard it put it to you like that, that there was a possibility that it might not survive?
Absolutely, yeah. And that was news to me, you know.
Yeah.
That was absolutely news to me. Um, I hadn't visited really any Gaeltacht area at the time. So in in my mind, there were these large chunks of the country, well, relatively speaking, where everybody was yapping away as Gaeilge. And of course, as I visited the Gaeltacht areas over the years, then subsequently to that, I recognised that that definitely is not the case. Um, Now, obviously, there are strong Gaeltacht areas and there are weaker ones in terms of usage of the language. But yeah, that was a real shock to me, the idea that we could use the language. And it was a motivator for me to get involved. I guess I've always been um, a bit of an activist. When I was a kid, I ran a fundraiser to raise money for Troker's work in Africa. Myself and some friends organized a football marathon in 2005, 2006 to raise money for the crisis in Darfur with concern. I've done voluntary work for Dublin Simon community for a few years on and off. I did the super run in Dublin on a Friday night. And then I did 3 years voluntary work as a volunteer counsellor there as well. Um, so I've always taken my role as a citizen seriously, and I think civic engagement is really important. I think there's no point us all sitting on the fence and looking at issues in society and going, "Oh, isn't that terrible?" We have to roll up our sleeves and get involved if we care about things, and that's the attitude I've always taken to things. That if you want something to happen, make it happen instead of sitting there shooting your mouth off doing nothing about it, you know?
It's so true, and it's so powerful when to see somebody taking action like that, Derek, because there is a strong inclination for people just to kind of, shrug their shoulders and say, "Well, look, sure, what's to be done?" And you're showing what somebody can achieve and make what impact somebody can make just by getting out there and taking action. But talk, Derek, to me about then. Okay, so now I want to come back to Pobl Gaeilge Cúig and maybe explore a little bit more about what that looks like and what that's about. But can I just maybe, if you like, separate out then? You had this kind of moment of let's say just realization or revelation, let's say, in relation to the language and the prospect that it faced, and you became aware that this was a language that was under threat and it might not survive, and you might have to do something to be part of something to hopefully prevent that. Um, so there you were, and by your own admission, saying you didn't have any real proficiency in the language, hadn't really you would be very, very similar to my story in terms of your language experience, Irish language experience at school. What did starting that learning journey in 2011, what did that look like? And what has that looked like for you since? How did you go about it?
The first thing I did was enroll in a course with Conor na Gaeilge in Harcourt Street in Dublin. Um, and I think it was a very low level, like at the time, I guess it was probably um, A1, if you look at the European languages framework level, I guess I was probably A1 at the time. So I would have remembered certain phrases from school. I remember when I was writing that dreadful essay in my leaving cert that I just tried to put every word of Irish I knew in it. So I had certain phrases like ar nos na gaoithe, um, egg etchelt for flying, Madra or for fox or whatever. There'd be a few little things I could remember. So I tried to use everything I could in that essay. And so some of those words, some of that vocabulary, limited as it was, is still there. And it's an advantage, I suppose, for people who go back to the language, having been through the school system, that you're not an absolute beginner in that sense. You probably know the word for mother, father, man, woman, those kind of things, animals, colors. You probably have some basic knowledge there. So I went back, I did a course with Conor na Gaeilge, and then in our area here in Dublin 15, myself and some local parents got together and we approached the Dublin Dunleera Education and Training Board and asked them would they run a course here. So they got a brilliant teacher at the time. We set up the course in a local community centre, and we had like 10 or 15 people regularly attending that for a number of years. These would typically be people who had children in Neenra or Gaelscoil, but not exclusively. And so we had a little bit of a core group then with that class. So as our standard of Irish went up, then we tried to through Public Gaeilge Cuaig Day, we tried to create opportunities for people to engage the language and use the language. That included things like a group of Tisti agus Lani, a parent and child group in the local community centre on a Saturday morning, where people could come in with their toddlers and use Irish. And it might be very basic. It might be reading from an Irish language book or whatever, but you're mixing with people that had some Irish, and that helped you, that inspired you to get to the next level and so on. So that was one part of it. Then we would organise trips to the Gaeltacht. Maybe we'd go out to Fell on the Mee and Rathcairn, which isn't that far really from West Dublin. And we'd have social nights. We went out to Oris Cronon in Clondalkin a couple of times. And we would have this ran for several years, and it's been reinstated last year. We would have a big Kjolkorm, a big concert every year in Ongar Community Centre, and we would invite local schools to participate in this concert, and then we would try and have guest speakers or headline acts. So we'd have people like Michal and Hertig speaking, Blondie Coffey. We had Tura Aratura originally from Zimbabwe, great inspiration to me, coming to Ireland in his 30s, learning the Irish language, learning Sean-Nós dancing, competing in the Oireachtas and Sean-Nós dancing. Like he's some guy. So he was performing. We had Shulin one year, and we would have the local schools participating in that as well. And what was great to see was there was one local school actually where two of the primary teachers would teach Irish, sport and art through Irish. So it's an English medium school now, but two teachers just taking it upon themselves to do this. And the kids from that school would be marching up onto the stage to do their songs or their drama or whatever it was, proudly wearing their fáinne. Like 90% of these kids, family backgrounds would have been from maybe Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe. And they were like fluently speaking in Irish at 10, 11 years of age. It was really brilliant to see. No qualms, no inhibitions. Most of these kids would be coming from bilingual or multilingual families anyway. And it just shows you what can be done with a little bit of effort. And that was an English medium school, So we tried to help everybody along on their language journey by organising these various social events. So for me, the language journey has been about dipping in and out of Irish over the years. I was studying at night as well. I have 3 children. And so it wasn't plain sailing. Unfortunately, I would have loved to have really thrown myself into it and done it over 2 or 3 years. But I'm still probably, if my English is 95%, we'll say, my Irish is about 60% maybe. So, and different things impact on that. If I'm very tired, if I have a headache, if I have brain fog from the amount of work I'm doing or something like that, that impacts on my ability to use my Irish. And I feel very dumbed down at times. So maybe other learners will relate to that feeling as well.
Oh, so much. I can so relate to that. I mean, as you were saying it, I was just, I mean, I find particularly if and I find myself, I get increasingly tired, increasingly quickly when using Irish as well. And then I've been absolutely drained and feel like a complete dullard trying to engage the language. So can completely relate to that. I mean, I would just salute you in terms of your persistent continuing journey with the language. I can hear you kind of apologizing for not having done it as fish based. Please don't apologize. Derera Kayla Atogal Nakashlan. I mean, you are just continuously doing it, and it's phenomenal to see. But talk to me there, although, about even because you mentioned a word there that particularly related to me, or I found relatable, was about opportunities to use the language, and this is a huge challenge I think that we face as learners, because oftentimes the opportunities to use can be very, very thin on the ground, and of course we always find ourselves in a situation where if we're engaging with another person of Irish background, it's I think almost universally the case that they're going to have fluent English. So we both know that the easy option is to just revert into English, and we'll have a perfectly proficient conversation with no real effort. So it seems to me I mean, obviously you're making huge efforts in terms of your language journey learning, but the decision to create Pobl Gaeilge Cúigiag strikes me as a particularly inspired one, because by doing that you kind of created a community of, you know, people of mixed abilities, all of whom are kind of, you know, making various degrees of effort to participate with each other using the language.
That's it, 100%. You hit the nail on the head there. Sometimes you have to create your own community. And again, this is where a bit of brazenness can be very helpful. You know, putting yourself out there, trying to get to know other like-minded people and that. Um, and just trying not to be too self-conscious about it. I would ask why, when we have a native language, why is it such a taboo thing for people to try and engage with other people in Irish anyway? But I suppose, yeah, the default position is English for the vast majority of people, and it can be difficult. You can feel isolated. In Dublin, in Gaeltacht areas, I think it's easier to find groups of people. We see great work being done in West Belfast over generations there, and at the tourist project there with Linda Irvine as well. Um, so in certain urban areas and in Gaeltacht areas, I think it's probably easier to connect with other people. But yeah, I think that's part of the challenge, is that if you learn French and go to France, you can just walk into a shop and speak French. Whereas in Ireland, I think very much you have to create your own speaker community around you. Now, you know, you could, for people maybe listening to this who are thinking, how would I even start that? You could get in touch with Cunna na Gaeilge and see if there's local groups or local members in your area, and they could try and put you in touch with those. Um, the internet is a great way of connecting with people. We see that on platforms such as Twitter. At the moment, we have a 100 Days of Gaeilge kind of challenge going on, where there's lots of people from around the world trying to brush up on their Irish, improve their Irish language skills, develop Irish as part of their lives, and being able to connect with each other just using that simple hashtag 100 Days of Gaeilge. So there's, I suppose, the internet and technology has created new opportunities for us to be able to engage with each other. It's certainly, I don't think, in terms of the health of the language, going to compensate for loss of a physical on the ground community in Gaeltacht areas. I don't think you can replicate that exactly. And I don't think it's an adequate substitute for a living, functioning speaker community. But for the rest of us that don't live in the Gaeltacht, um, it's the best we can do, and it's probably good enough.
Well, it's I mean, because I want to come to the Gaeltacht, because that is a huge question. I think that in terms of the future and survival of the language, it's a critical one. But let's say, just maybe talking about your context there, and I mean what you've done with the creation of Public Gaelic Cúigiag is immense. But can you talk to us about what the language looks like in the city, and what the, you know, what's it like in terms of your ability to use the language across the city, the various different Irish language centers, events, occasions. What's that look like now?
I think Dublin is badly lacking a facility like the Cultalan in on the Falls Road there in West Belfast. You know, there is Club Cunna na Gaeilge, and that's useful. But in terms, and it is going to be redeveloped, right? That side on Harcourt Street, and there's Oris Cronin as well. But I guess there's a sense that Dublin doesn't really have a flagship place where people can push themselves into. And I think for some people that I've encountered in Irish language classes over the years, there's an intimidation about going into Cunna na Gaeilge, because there's a sense that they're proper Irish speakers, and I'm not a proper Irish speaker because I'm only a learner. Now, this might be in the head of the individual. I'm not saying that's what's projected from people who go to Club Cunna na Gaeilge, but there is this sense of, particularly even the entrance to Club Cunna na Gaeilge is underground. Well, you know, you have to go down the stairs from Harcourt Street. So for some people, I think that experience is quite intimidating. So it'll be interesting to see how they develop that facility there. I think generally you get to know people through the different classes, through Public Welga Cuig, from going to the great pop-up Gaeltacht events that are around the city from time to time. So you start bumping into the same people over and over again. You know, thankfully Dublin isn't that big yet that you're completely anonymous in the city. And you know, when I think back to when I did my leaving cert, there was no pop-up Gaeltacht then. There was no Kieran EA. There was no kneecap. Do you know? So there's a lot to get excited about there. Um, there is new culture being produced in the Irish language across the country, in Dublin, in the Gaeltacht, in Belfast, and that's a really important part, I think, for the language, that there's new culture being produced. So that's a real positive. So as I say, you do start to get familiar with people when you attend the pop-up Gaeltacht events, and things like that. You'd see the familiar faces then at the kneecap gigs or whatever. And through Instagram and Twitter and all the platforms, it's much easier to advertise events and to tap into like-minded people. So that's I think that's a huge development from when I left school.
Immense. And I mean, and if you, I just think about the ability to actually just connect. I mean, first of all, you know, we have in this phone in our pockets, we have access to basically all the information that has ever been generated on is there online for us, and you know, so our ability to access resources in terms of learning resources, ability to connect with other people to learn and to use the language and so on. It's extraordinary, and obviously, you know, that's developing continuously in terms of a positive story in terms of language, and yes, completely. I think you have these new artists creating Oscuelga and developing art and the language itself by the innovative ways in which they're using it and expressing themselves through it. So that's extraordinary. But what could we just come back for a second, just because you mentioned group Tishti Agus Lani, and obviously the emphasis on raising kids and girls and so on was a key kind of, if you like, piece of this that I take from you. Would you mind just speaking about your own experience as a parent and raising kids? Is that something? Were you able to achieve having them go to a girls' school, and how do you use Irish with them? And would you mind talking to us about that?
Sure, yeah. So for me, as I was saying, there are times when I find it very challenging to use Irish, just if I'm fatigued and things like that. So I would try and have certain parts of the day where it's, you know, I just use Irish and nothing else. So for example, the school run, it's only Irish in the car. Dinner time, I would try and only speak Irish to the kids as well. And then whenever I'm inspired or full of beans or energy or whatever like that, I'll be trying to speak to them in Irish. So, for example, there was a holiday we were on in Italy before, and actually I found it to be a much more conducive environment for speaking Irish, because there were so many languages around. And there was so little English in the place we were. You would meet many Italians that had no English whatsoever. So it just seemed natural for people to be speaking in different languages other than English. And I noticed the kids were much more responsive to that as well. And they spoke with me much more in Irish than they normally would. I think, you know, kids aren't stupid. You often hear criticism of the Gael Skunla because people will say, oh, they only speak Irish to the gate to the Gael School or whatever. It doesn't mean kids can't speak Irish, but they're attuned to the culture surrounding them. And until we can create a culture, generally speaking, across the island that's more conducive to bilingualism and shows more respect to the language, of course, children are going to slip into the language of the street, the language of their peers, and the language they hear all around them. So my kids at times would only be speaking back to me in English. And, you know, that can be disconcerting at times. I did meet a man a few years ago who told me he had 3 children. He raised them in Irish. He spoke to them in Irish every day, and they got to a certain age where they would only speak back to him in English, so they understood everything. And he said he had no regrets about that whatsoever. And interestingly, when they became parents themselves, they started to raise their kids in Irish, and they sent them to Gaelscoill. So it was worth it, you know, according to that man, it was worth the effort, even if they hadn't have done that, you know. So my children have much more Irish in their lives than I had growing up. My
And so,
my
sorry, just to be clear, Derek, are they attending a girls' school?
So all three attended Guelph School. One is still in the Guelph School, and two have gone on to Mon School. It's an English medium secondary school. The choice there was to do with friends and location and things like that. And the children wanted to go there, so I kind of respected that. I want them to have some autonomy over their own lives and so on. Um, so my eldest has been to the
But
Guelph.
just sorry to interrupt you, but just as a matter of interest, was there a choice? Was there a Gael Colossus available if you had wished to go to, if they had wished to go there?
Yes, well, there's an Aonid near us here in Dublin 15. I was actually involved at the start of that campaign, and there was great work done by a couple of people here in the area to have that set up. So there is an Aonid at the moment in Dublin 15 as part of a different school, an English medium secondary school for the time being. Um, but unfortunately, it was a little bit further away, and the kids' friends weren't going there, so they really wanted to go to one of the local schools. Um, so my eldest has been to the Gaeltacht. He went to Colossalurg and Micheál Field's place there last summer, and he had an absolutely phenomenal time. And I've noticed since he had that experience of using Irish as a non-school language, he's much more comfortable speaking to me in Irish now, and we'll have lots of chats as Gaeilge. So he he has seen Irish as a social language. Irish as a language where you communicate with your friends, where you have fun, where you know, go to the Cayley and chat to people, go swimming in the sea, and all of the different activities that they have in the Gaeltacht. So that has made a huge difference for him. So the Gael School, I think, gave him the ability to use the Irish, but it was the Gaeltacht experience that gave him the inspiration to use Irish. And for my younger two now, the eldest of those hasn't gone to the Gaeltacht yet. Hopefully next year, and then the younger one is in primary in Rangacahar, and be a mixed bag now with the amount of Irish they'd speak back to me with them, you know. But I keep cracking away.
Oh, well, Mahu, it's extraordinary. I mean, because that is the thing that I've heard again and again and again about, particularly people, who raising their kids, and the kids are, very, very good Irish, but speaking back after a certain age, to speak back to the parent in English, and I mean, there's a point to which it gets counterproductive if you're trying to flogging a dead horse. At point it might feel, but that's very, very interesting in terms of how that then evolved in terms of the subsequent generation with that man you were speaking of, in terms of them then subsequently going on to raising their kids to Irish. But there's another thing there, isn't there? It's about kind of relationships, and I mean, and this is a thing that I find very, very challenging. With somebody I have a relationship with, where the relationship has commenced in English, most of the relationships that I have to say, um, it's it seems very, very difficult to switch over into Irish for can we say in inverted commas natural conversation. When, let's say, the relationship we're used to having with one another is in English to begin with. That's something that feels odd to me.
Yeah, I guess it takes two to make a commitment to speak Irish
Mhm.
under those circumstances. I actually have a friend, one of the lads who's involved on our committee with Public Welga Cuig, and he has a good friend himself. And they went to Gael school together, and they left school, and they would always speak to each other in English outside of school. And when they were 19, they decided that they were only going to speak Irish to each other from that point on. And now they don't speak a word of English to each other, and they're grown men with families or careers or whatever. So it can be done. I think attitude and commitment are really important in this regard. But yeah, there's also the post-colonial hangover there, I think, Finian. Um, I actually a couple of times was in Irish classes with people who I remember they said they would be self-conscious about using Irish socially outside the classroom. I couldn't believe it. I was like, is that for real? So I actually had the chance to test that out. I feel a bit bad about this, but I had the chance to test that out when I bumped into one of them on a train subsequent to that, and they were speaking to somebody else as I walked down the aisle of the carriage, and I engaged them in Irish, as they kind of thought to Ainscale or whatever, Ainscale, and they looked mortified and they answered me in English, So, but I really think there is a post-colonial hangover there, and there is an undercurrent or this idea that Irish, I'm not saying everybody has this, by the way, but it's there, that the Irish language, Gaelic culture is inferior to what the Anglosphere produces. And somebody made a comment on a radio show there recently. They said, we have to make a choice about this. Are we going to be mindless consumers of whatever the Anglosphere produces, whether it's on streaming services or in film or music or whatever? Is culture going to be eating a chicken roll for your lunch and then engaging with, sports played in different countries through a screen? You sit there passively absorbing this sport and then paying for it in subscriptions, and buying jerseys of clubs around the world. For me, that's a very passive existence. What's wrong with sort of, and I'm not saying loads of people just live like that or whatever, that people are brain dead or whatever. And obviously these things have a place in life. Sport has a place, and meeting friends in the pub to watch a match and whatever, that obviously does have a place as well. But do we want to acknowledge that we have a native language and a culture and a heritage that's passed on to us through generations and generations and through time immemorial back to prehistory? Do we want to cherish that? Because if we don't want to cherish that, we're just pretending if we're going to call ourselves Europeans, or we're just pretending if we're going to call ourselves multicultural or open-minded, or if we're going to claim to have any value on culture. If we can't recognize what is right there under our noses, then there's something going on that needs to be questioned. So I do think the post-colonial influence is very significant in Ireland. And for me, in my research, I've been researching and writing a book over a number of years on the attitudes and the psychology influencing use of Irish in Ireland. And it's really interesting to hear respected figures in post-colonial studies and commentary on global issues, people like Edward Said, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Noam Chomsky, and their reflections on Ireland, the way they put Ireland into similar experiences of other countries around the world that experience colonialism, language shift, and things like that. So when you hear people of that stature talking about it, I do think it's something we need to take seriously, and I do think it's something that impacts on the status of Irish in Ireland.
Oh, completely. And that's I mean, that's a subject that is just that really resonates deeply with me. I mean, would you mind just digging in a little deeper into that in terms of, when they place what kind of where what are the would you mind just explain going into that in a little bit more depth, because I'm absolutely fascinated by it.
Sure, yeah. Well, one of the articles I wrote on the blog, the irishlanguagematters.com blog, focused on Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's like a post-colonial theorist and writer from Kenya. And he talks about how the native languages, I think his native language is Gikuyu, and he talks about how the native languages in Kenya were diminished and the colonial language elevated there. But it was interesting to hear him refer to Ireland in that context as well. And he spoke about, for example, a lot of the colonialists from the 16th century, the likes of Edmund Spenser, Walter Raleigh, Fynes Morrison, some of these writers, they really zoned in on the Irish language. They said, they claimed, and this kind of propaganda was going on for centuries, propagated also by people like Shakespeare, who's very much revered, obviously. But they claimed that the Irish were barbarous, uncivilized. They ate their fathers, all this kind of stuff, going back to Geraldus Cambrensis, who arrived as a propagandist, like with the Anglo-Normans. But you had people like Edmund Spenser, the revered poet, talking about scorched policies being appropriate to Ireland because these people were subhuman, and why couldn't they complete the conquest of Ireland 400 years in? So Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about how Spencer advocated for targeting the language and the naming systems, the mock and the knee and the O and all that. I remember watching England play Iceland in soccer there, maybe 7-10 years ago, something like that. And I thought it was really cool the way the Icelandic team all had their native naming structure and all their surnames. They had them. But Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about that, how the theory was that if you could target the language and the naming system in Ireland, that you could make the Irish forget who they were and they would stop rebelling and they would be just good English citizens then. This idea of erasing the memory, erase the language. And, I have to say, I grew up not really familiar with Irish language literature, Irish language stories, historical figures who even today, in most cases, have their names presented in the English form rather than their Irish form, which they would have used at the time. If you think about people like Amor O'Neill or Granuaile or whatever, often these names are now anglicized. Like, we don't anglicize Thierry Henry. So why do we have to anglicize Irish people who have Irish language names? So I think there is that hangover in Ireland that we're still in a post-colonial phase, and that really a modern Ireland has to create a place for its own native culture. And it's not an either or. I think this is really important. It's not about the Irish language versus the English language. We can have, like the Scandinavians, for example, we can have that global language, if you like, on the one hand, but we can conduct our culture through our native language as well and have social interactions. And it's not about displacing English or anything like that. English is never going to be displaced, but it is about creating space and giving oxygen to this importance. I think the most important cultural resource we have is the Irish language.
I couldn't agree with you more. And just you mentioned oxygen there, because I think it's a quote. I think it's Ngugi who says that multilingualism is the oxygen of culture, and that monolingualism is the carbon monoxide of culture. That it's through multiple languages that all of these different kind of cross connections and possibilities and ideas just explode in our brains and in our communities. But that is fascinating, Derek, and it is extraordinary when you mention guys like Spencer going back to the 16th century. And I mean, they had quite a sophisticated plan in terms of, targeting the language was a key element in the whole colonial project from very, very early on. And then to link that forward, 500 years to the way we feel about what it's like to use the language, and the fact that we still feel an innate kind of sense, unconsciously, that English is the prestige language, and that's the one that we really that we're not properly civilized or sophisticated unless we're proficient in it and using it.
Yeah, 100%. Kind of sad.
It's very, very sad, but there's another dimension to it, and it's extraordinarily sad. And because you mentioned there, you mentioned Shakespeare, right? And I mean, I'm no great scholar of English literature or any literature really, and wouldn't be proficient to be any scholar of Irish literature yet, but you do have we've all, if we studied English in secondary school, you'll have studied a Shakespearean play for the, in my day it was the inter cert and the junior cert now, and similarly another one for the leaving cert. I did Romeo and Juliet and I did Othello, and I can still remember passages from each, or certainly phrases from each, and they're phrases that come across then into the into the culture. And it would be extraordinary for an English person not to be able to, to read Shakespeare directly and okay, it's Elizabethan English, it's going to be a little bit difficult, but secondary school students can study it and have to study it. But the fact that we as a people, Irish people, don't have the basic proficiency to be able to engage with, cultural artifacts, pieces of literature that are just absolutely central to our heritage and culture, and and that we just simply don't have the basic proficiency to be able to engage with those things directly. I mean, like that's what it seems to me is the massive prize here is this connection with our past and our culture, because if we're not able to do it in our native language, well, I mean, we're there's this disconnect.
Absolutely, yeah. And interestingly, I think I'm no scholar of English literature either, I have to say, but I think Shakespeare wrote a lot about, or he included a few Irish characters, some of them kind of stereotypical characters, from around 1596 to 1599, and it was during the period of the 9 Years' War where the clans were they were getting well on top, and there was every danger that the crown was going to be banished from Ireland at the time. And you had all these villages across Middle England that were being emptied out of their young men, and they weren't coming home. So Ireland was very much the bogeyman in the English psyche at the time. And it's interesting when you see these contemporary depictions or these modern depictions of, say, Elizabeth the First time or whatever, these glamorous movies. Ireland is completely excluded from them. There's no mention. So it's like, Vea Victis, woe to the vanquished. We're not even worthy of being the bad guy in a lot of the productions of that time now in the English language. So I mean, I got the kids this DVD. I'd say, I don't know, it's probably 10 or more years ago. Anna Auron, produced by Cartoon Saloon in Ireland, and it was news to me. Again, I hadn't engaged with a lot of these things before. I heard some of the songs in school or whatever, but it was a DVD produced by Cartoon Saloon, and it featured a lot of traditional Irish songs. You have like Codation, Duntation, Oro Shadavalia, and Pucker Buillia, Banfodine, and Gracie Brogue, things like that. And brilliant, beautiful images on screen accompanying these songs. And I was delighted to have that for the kids and to play for them when they were small. But it made me kind of sad. And I'm thinking of Imelda May expressed it very well one time, but I felt I was robbed of what was mine because I wasn't familiar with these songs. Never mind the meaning of them, even the melodies. Some of these beautiful tunes. It's a great version of Kyloch on Arrogate on that as well. And yeah, I kind of felt that I had lost so much. And growing up in suburban Dublin, I invested an awful lot of time in watching the BBC and Top of the Pops or whatever, going to the pub to watch sport on the big screen and all this kind of stuff. I kind of feel at this point in my life, I've had enough of kind of that. I want to focus on what I lost out on, and I want to bring back the richness of that culture into my life. I want to access what is mine and that I couldn't access, as you said earlier.
And and congratulations. I just think it's fantastic that you're doing that. It's absolutely immense. But there's another kind of cruel, ironic dimension to this as well, I think, because you mentioned this idea that people might be reluctant to use the language because of a sense of inferiority, because of this, and the background to that is this, quite deliberate and calculated colonial process, which said, English is a prestige language and we must, it's the one that everybody wants to speak. And I suppose that was imposed, but also then there was a practical economic reality where people said, look, I want my kids to learn English because that's where opportunity will come from. That if you want to get ahead here or anywhere across the world, it's via English you're going to have to do it. It's the language of power, of law, of agency, and that was the realpolitik, whatever about people felt in their hearts. But and it's just extraordinary that resonates with us today, or echoes down to us today in terms of people feeling perhaps an inferiority in using the language. But there's a flip side to that, though, isn't there? That sometimes as English speakers, having come up through the Irish education system, who don't speak Irish are maybe a little bit what's the word? Just feel um, let's say they're embarrassed about the standard of their Irish and that it isn't good enough, but maybe see Irish speakers as superior, that it's seen as something there's superiority. I'm speaking to people outside of the Irish language community who maybe see that as something that they can't access and that therefore they feel some antipathy towards it, and then you get this backlash against the language where people say, "Oh, it's a dead language. Why are we forced to learn it? We shouldn't be." So like it's like we see. I know Queven DeBarra mentions this or used this kind of concept quite a bit. That I think people, the hatred that comes across for the language is almost like trying to get it out of our heads or out of our because we have this cognitive dissonance where we know it's our native language, but we can't speak it. And therefore, either it's the language's fault because it's too difficult, or and the only way to really kind of deal with that is to just reject it, and that's where this extraordinary kind of hatred comes from, I think, at times.
Yeah, it's gas, and it does come out in many ways. I think there's a small but vocal minority that show that kind of antipathy towards the language, but they're certainly vocal and loud. And I think part of the agenda there is sometimes to create an atmosphere where people are afraid to use the language. I do think in certain cases, particularly in media, that might be the case. Yeah, and rejection of the other is always the easiest thing to do. It's always easiest to look at somebody else and blame them or blame that thing, that language or that culture or whatever. Time has moved on, we've moved on. Oh, that was the past. It's kind of easy to say those things, but if we truly value culture, just generally speaking, if you value heritage, if you value the built heritage that we have in Ireland, if we value the beautiful landscape that we have in Ireland, if we value culture like opera, traditional music, rock music, pop music, hip hop, if we claim to value these things, then surely the Irish language has to be part of that. Surely all language, the wealth of the libraries produced by a people in a particular place or whatever, surely that is worth treasuring. Because it's not just an element of the culture, it embraces all. And I've seen even academics and historians and that referring to the idea that the language was targeted by colonialism, or that colonialism alone was responsible for the language shift, as like a narrow and nationalist narrative, dismissing it as a narrow nationalist narrative. I think if you look at it fairly, the language shift was purely down to colonialism, whether directly or indirectly. Even all the indirect things that led to the language shift, they all stemmed from colonialism. You can join the dots between the dispossession of the Gaelic Catholics and on Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger. That was a disaster waiting to happen because of what had gone before. But I don't think there's any point kind of being bitter about the history. we have a choice as to where we go with it from here. And it's brilliant that there's still a language. In some ways, it's amazing that it has survived to this point, and that we still have people using Irish as their daily language, particularly in places like Gweedore and Connemara and the islands and that. It's brilliant that we have the technology now that people like yourself and myself can engage with each other and with the language and with resources. You resources with your podcast, which is brilliant. So it can be done. The resources are there to do it in terms of linking more people with the language. So I think we have to focus on the positive and ask ourselves, what can I do to advance this cause if it's important to me to protect the language?
Oh, completely. And just listening to you there, and it comes across so strongly your passion about that, I say it resonates with me very, very deeply. And we're certainly I think we understand one another in relation to that. But just listening to it, I was thinking to myself, yes, for sure, this is an extraordinarily valuable and precious cultural heritage that we have, and that in order to be able to access it, the language is the only way in, and it's vital for that, and it's so there are all of these really good um reasons, why this should be the case. But it can be very hard work to do,
Yeah.
to learn the language, and it can be very difficult to have to, if to put up with. We were talking about the cognitive dissonance, as an adult making mistakes, sounding stupid, feeling like a dullard, just being tired and exhausted by having to work very hard in learning or understanding or expressing yourself in a language that's not coming, as you might say, naturally to you. So there's a lot of hard work there. And I mean, and there may be very good reasons why we should do that hard work. And maybe some of us are very passionate about doing that, for those good reasons. But what about just having some fun and enjoying ourselves and deriving pleasure from things, either in the language itself or through the language? How do you what do you do to have fun, Oscuelga, or to enjoy your use of the language and participation with the language?
I love the social events. I love meeting people. Um, I've been to pop-up Gaeltacht events where people come in and they mostly speak English. They might say Gurmagot, Slán, whatever. They just want to be in that environment. They just want to meet other people who are passionate about the language. And then as people's proficiency develops, they're better able to engage in those kind of events. Um, I have always found, I don't know if everybody else has this experience, but I've always found Irish speaking social groups to be very welcoming, very non-judgmental about anybody's standard. I don't really, maybe it's happened, but I don't remember ever being corrected by somebody for using bad grammar. Like, we don't do it in English, so do we need to do it in Irish? No, and I don't think it happens that much anymore. Um, so social events, pop-up Gaeltacht events, talking to my kids in Irish. Being on a holiday, I remember one time, again, we were on a holiday a few years back and we were speaking Irish in the swimming pool, and I remember the the faces of a few people sitting around the pool trying to work out what language this was. You could almost hear their brains uh, clunking into gear, and I thought that was quite funny. You know, having special moments with your kids in Irish or bilingually or whatever. We had great holidays, a couple of great holidays up in the Gaeltacht and Gweedore. And we just happened to get the weather, and we were out playing volleyball on the beach every day and swimming in the sea and surfing and all this kind of stuff. Took my first surf lesson in my 40s. You're never too old to try anything. But yeah, those great shared experiences with other people, I think, is where I get my pleasure from the language. Now, also listen to some Irish language music. Um, that there's that Christmas song. What is it? On Iha Uda Mehel. Miha Uden Metal, like that is such a wonderful tune. The melody is gorgeous, and I've heard that it might be from as early as the 8th century. That is a beautiful piece of music that I never encountered before I started learning Irish. Do you know, um, Terra Wallaroo by Clannad. That was my most listened to song and watched video on YouTube last year. Like, again, it's a discovery of a little gem and nugget that I never would have been aware of had I not started on this journey. So I need to do more with my reading in Irish, but in terms of listening to Irish language music and engaging with people socially, that's where I get the pleasure from. And that gives me the fuel to keep going with the crappy side of it. I don't like books and grammar and study. I don't enjoy that stuff. It doesn't come naturally to me. But you get the fuel for that then from the things that you do enjoy.
Oh, that's so inspirational. I mean, just like just being able to, because and I love first of all that idea of that invitation to pop up Gaeltacht, to come in and maybe not having any proficiency, starting off, maybe using a lot of English. I mean, we're having this conversation, Os Béarla. I've heard a lot of people, I sometimes see online people expressing regret that the podcast isn't Os Gaeilge, and the primary reason is, I mean, from my perspective, and I saw you writing the same thing in your blog, I said, when I started this, certainly I didn't feel that I had the proficiency in Irish to be able to, I wouldn't subject listeners to my Irish for our guests indeed for a podcast. But more importantly, actually, the reason it is in English was in order to enable people who don't have the proficiency to engage with, learn about the language, learn about, your experience as an Irish language learner, and maybe hopefully take some inspiration from that, and hopefully just be able to follow the example of some others, or see what's worked for them and what might work for others. So I love that inclusivity and that drawing people in, and that you mentioned there from the pop of Gaeltacht, and being able to just have fun, have crack, and enjoy the language at whatever level you're able to participate in it, and then of course progression into music and song and all of that. It's phenomenal. But you mentioned the Gaeltacht as well, Derek, and just as we come towards the end of the conversation, it's something that I do want to, because it's like, I don't know, someone I know, you listen to a lot of Irish language media, and I do quite a bit, and we hear there all of the time continuously about the threats and challenges that the Gaeltachts are facing and are subject to, and the difficulties that Gaeltacht dwellers have in being able to make their homes in the Gaeltacht and continue to live their lives in their own communities using their native language. And it's something that, we don't hear anything about in the English language media, I don't think. I don't, I mean, snippets, but there doesn't seem to be a general awareness of it. What are your thoughts around that now for us as a society here in Ireland in 2024?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt the studies have shown that the Gaeltacht is under threat. You go to different Gaeltacht areas. I'm not going to embarrass anybody by naming places, but I've gone to a couple of Gaeltacht areas and been surprised that I just didn't hear any Irish anywhere. And I've been told by different people that, if you go in the winter or whatever, when tourists aren't around, you're going to hear a lot more Irish because it's just going to be natives around the place. But then there are strong Gaeltacht areas I visited. I was in Ishir for a week with the kids. I was in Gweedore for a couple of weeks with the kids. Been to Connemara a good few times, and there's lots of Irish out there still, and there's no reason why that can't remain and be developed. There's been proposals and studies done by people like Crahur O'Gilligan. They don't get a lot of oxygen in the English language media. Again, it's that thing of othering the Gaelic culture and the Irish language, possibly. It may also be hard for people to write about these things when they feel that they can't engage with them through the native language and that. But yeah, I think the Irish language movement still needs to be developed a little bit further to bring more people in. I was listening to Noam Chomsky talking about the protests against the Vietnam War in the United States of America in the 1960s, and he was saying that 4 years the protests were grassroots level, and it was public demand and so on, and that eventually the energy from that started to produce leaders, some of whom found their way into politics that could have an influence. And I think the Irish language movement has to be developed further so that we bring more people in. And to be honest with you, and I don't mean to sound arrogant or anything like that when I say this, but I think people like yourself, and maybe even my own blog or whatever, are important. I don't feel I have a lot to say to somebody who's a native speaker who grew up in the West, for example. What can I offer them? What can I say to them? Very little. But I can speak to my constituency, which is the people like my friends, like my cousins who grew up with no Irish, and hopefully, it's people like that that can be brought in to demand, excuse me, that we protect our language and that it has a place in society moving forward, and that the children who are going to Gael School today can have opportunities in broader society without feeling self-conscious about speaking the language. So I think it's okay. I understand native speakers and proficient Irish speakers who are frustrated that there's so much talk about Irish rather than in Irish. But at the same time, yeah, I feel I want to share my journey with other people who are Gaeilge curious, shall we say, right? Like because it took me a while. I remember reading news on the Gaelport website for years. It was bilingual. They would have an Irish language report and they would have it in English, and I couldn't read the Irish, so I would just read the English about Irish before I actually jumped in and started attending classes and stuff like that. I'd become curious about the Irish language, and I'd come to the opinion that this was important. So I think it's still important that we engage with wider society and bring them into the Irish language movement so that we can produce a groundswell of energy and opinion that does lead to the language being protected in the future.
Oh, that's such a great take on that, Derek. I love the idea of meeting people where they are. Now, of course, you know, there are the huge challenge facing the Gaelic and Irish as a community language, and it's something that I think we're going to have to create more awareness of that in the English language speaking community. But I love your take on actually just, as I say, you know, you speaking to the people who are part of your community and inspiring inspiring the Irish language in them, and it's all part of an overall movement to save or to not to save, but I think just for us to use our language together into the future as a people. It's phenomenal, and the part you're playing in it is immense. Derek, as we kind of wrap it up here, the question that I kind of put to our guests here, the big one for me is always, why do you do all of this? I mean, you're somebody now who's been coming back to this as a learner for over 10 years. You've devoted a huge part of your life and extraordinarily busy. You're working your job, you're raising your kids, you're doing all of these other things that you're doing in your life, but you're also then going back and learning this language that we all both acknowledge is you know, comes with great challenges to us as adult learners. Why do you do all that? What's your Irish language? Why? What motivates you when it comes to the Irish language?
Yeah, I find that hard to explain. I just feel a visceral connection to the language. Do you know, I'm just driven. I don't know. Maybe there's something wrong with me, but I just feel driven to do something about it. You know, it really is. It's like an innate thing that, right, this is important, and I want to be involved. But like I say, it's also enjoyable, like having a chat with your kids in Irish, or um, when you don't know a word and you ask one of your kids and they know it, or they know the term, or they correct something you've done grammatically. I love that. I just think it's brilliant. Um, I hope they will look back in the future and think that it was worthwhile, the energy I've put in to try and to create a more bilingual household for them than they would have had otherwise. So yeah, I can't really explain my drive to do it, but I just think it's important enough to engage with. You can't do everything. I'm always explaining to the kids, like, you have to pick your battles. And I've spent time doing other things in my life. I just feel like this is something I need to focus on now. And I'm sorry, I can't really articulate any better than that. It's just a visceral thing.
You don't need to apologize. I think you've answered that question beautifully. And I also, I mean, there's a phrase I've heard used and used very often is, we can do anything, we just can't do everything. So you have to focus, and you say choose your battles. And I'm also reminded of when you were speaking earlier about how you just, described your own, your sense of not, people can often just shrug their shoulders and say, oh, well, sure, look, that's just the way it is. Nothing could be done about it. You're the type of person who gets out and actually does something and believes that the actions of individuals can make a difference. And I think what you're doing here is testament to that. I'm also reminded of speaking about Maura Vernock, and she said to you, if we're going to survive, if the language is going to survive, you're going to have to raise your kids, go to the Gaeltacht or go to Gaelscoil. You've done that. You're doing that, my friend. It's extraordinary, and congratulations, Mahu Kogordagus Treslam Lanthakara. Derek Akara Gurav Mahagud Buenos Salt as an scale Ryan Tulin Berbua Agus Banachtakara.
Carmina Margot.
Thanks for listening. Gurav Mila Mahagud Asave Eishtucht. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I would really appreciate your feedback and would be eternally grateful if you would follow, rate and review the show. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your free valuable learning resources and to stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests and to receive exclusive content. Slán Tamil.